So I've been setting up the debate for you between these two positions that pick up on the two primary metaphors of what thinking is. The debate between the search inference framework, where thinking is like moving through a space, and the Gestalt framework, where thinking is like seeing, realizing things in attention and in perception. And as we've been doing that, we are progressively getting clearer about how we're going to operationalize thinking in terms of problem solving. And then what's at the core of problem solving is problem formulation, because problem formulation deals with combinatorial explosion and ill-definedness. And then we started to take a look at central issues concerning problem formulation. The question between the two positions is whether or not the problem formulation process is itself a computational process, a heuristic process. The search inference framework people are going to say yes it is, and the Gestalt people are going to say ultimately no, it is not a computational process, that those provocative heuristics are really not computational processing at all. And we took a look at how that might be the case. We took a look at the search inference framework's main candidate for a heuristic, the means-ends heuristic, and I showed you how its functionality was dependent on, first of all, the problem formulation has turned an ill-defined situation into a well-defined situation, and that the aspects of the heuristic itself depend on problem formulation in order to prevent them from being homuncular in nature. Once we had set that all up, we went into the debate. I filled you in on the other side, the Gestalt framework. We looked at the work of Kohler and Dunker and Wertheimer, and we saw progressively the working out of some notions of insight as a restructuring, and that this restructuring has something to do with transfer. And we saw that while there was a lot of important observations and some good experimental results, the Gestalt framework seems to lack any kind of coherent, unifying theoretical picture. Nevertheless, the Gestalt framework did present a challenge to the search inference framework, a challenge that was taken up by Weisberg and Anova in 1981, an experiment that claimed to demonstrate, I'm very clear on that, they seem to claim rather than just say this suggests, claim to demonstrate that there is no such thing as fixation, and since there's no such thing as fixation, and since the Gestalt tradition defined insight as the overcoming of fixation, there's no such thing as insight. We then took a look first at theoretical difficulties with that argument. We took a look at difficulties concerning Weisberg and Alba's alternative, which was compartmentalization, and arguments that the compartments themselves would require solving a lot of ill-defined problems, requiring a lot of insight, etc., and therefore it's circular to explain insight problem solving in terms of the use of compartments. However, I did point out that the connection between searching through the search space and searching through organized memory that is being emphasized by Weisberg and Alba is an important point we're going to keep coming back to. We then took a look at Ellen's point that it's highly unlikely that the answer to a problem is going to be found in an integrated fashion somewhere in memory. It is much more plausible that different pieces from different compartments in different areas that are non-contiguous have to be properly brought together, properly restructured to fit together such that they apply to the problem at hand, etc. So that whole aspect was not properly addressed. We then took a look at the work at Domanowski. He pointed out that Weisberg and Alba seem to be confusing necessity and sufficiency, and that seems to be driven by an assumption that there's a single difficulty that has to be overcome in order to solve the 9-dot problem, for example. Instead, it's probably the case that there are many different interacting constraints or issues that have to be simultaneously or in a dynamically integrated fashion dealt with in order for the problem to be solved. We'll come back to look at that specifically in later work by Kershaw and Olson. Finally, we took a look at the fact that Weisberg and Alba's clue, think outside the box, may not be the right type of clue because it may be propositional in nature, whereas the processing change that is needed is procedural in nature. It may not be inference about propositions. It may in fact be attention that is altering what is salient, kind of like what the Gestaltists have been arguing, and that might be the relevant issue that needs to happen in order for insight to occur, and that is why the procedural cue by Castleman and Meyer was facilitatory for solving the 9-dot problem, in contrast to Weisberg and all the failed proposal. Okay, any questions about that before we move on? We talked along the way about a lot of things like graphic suddenness versus phenomenological suddenness, and these issues will come back, but that's the core argument so far. Anything else that needs to be addressed? All right, so now I want to turn to the experimental responses to Weisberg and Anova. Because what I'm trying to again show you, I'm trying to model something. I've been very clear and explicit about a particular philosophy of science, the science involving this ongoing integration between theoretical debate and experimental competition. So now we've done the theoretical debate side, and we'll see how it interacts with the experimental composition. So that competition begins primarily with the work of Janet Metcalfe, who later went on to, I don't know if she's still working now or she's retired. Janet Metcalfe became a very pivotal figure in the emerging field of work on metacognition within cognitive psychology. It's plausible that this is one of the first areas where her career got its initial big boost. Okay? So Janet Metcalfe, we're going to take a look at 3 experiments. Now, the thing you have to remember about the middle experiment is it's like the middle book in a trilogy. Or the middle, there's exceptions to this rule. Most people think that The Empire Strikes Back was the best of the 3 movies. I don't include the prequels, which were punishments for humanity's sin that George Lucas inflicted on us. But generally, the middle book of a trilogy is unsatisfying because many things are unresolved in it. So when I'm teaching you the second experiment, it will feel unresolved to you. And there's a reason why it feels unresolved to you, because it's unresolved. Like the experiment comes to certain clues, the experiment has, of course, its results, but the theoretical issue is not fully resolved in the second experiment. It is only when we get to the third experiment that Metcalfe is able to bring it to a more satisfying theoretical claim. All right? So please remember, as I'm doing the second experiment, it'll be slightly dissatisfying, right? And then we'll get into the third experiment, and then we can sort of take it as a summation. Now, of course, along the way, you're free to ask clarification questions and make challenge questions, but I just wanted to forewarn you about sort of how the narrative is going to unfold. All right? Okay, let's take a look at the first experiment, which is 1986. Well, 1986A, because we're going to talk about 2 experiments, 2 separate experiments at different times within 1986. So Metcalfe, 1986A. No. This experiment, like I said, like I suggested to you, I think this is where her career in metacognition really started to take off, because she was going to make use of a metacognitive probe in order to study insight. So please look at the date. We don't have all of the sophisticated machinery, fMRIs and dense EEG and all that. We didn't have that in '86. So probing cognitive processes required quite a bit of experimental cleverness. So what Metcalfe uses is she uses a cognitive probe, ultimately a metacognitive probe. And what a probe is, right, is it's an independently studied and replicated and confirmed phenomena that you can be reliably confident is operating in a certain manner. So here's the one that you all know, because you get to, it's one of the things you have on your membership card when you go to the psychology party. I don't know if the philosophy department will even have cards, because maybe the cards don't exist. But I mean, you go to the psychology department parties, and one of the things you have to do is you have to talk about, you know, P equals 0.05, say that, oh, yes, of course, right? And one of the other things you have to be able to talk about at the drop of a hat is the Stroop effect. Because it's the most studied phenomenon in psychology. I kid you not. This has been actually investigated empirically. Colin McLeod in the 90s did a review of all the Stroop effects. In the 90s, it was already into, like, I think 500. It's been ongoing since. My favorite example, it seems apropos, is that a study entitled the following, The Effect of Lunch on the Stroop Effect. Apparently, if you have lunch, the Stroop effect isn't as bad. I don't know if that tells you much about the Stroop effect. I think that's just a general property of lunch. But it's a very well studied phenomenon. Okay, so you know what the Stroop effect is, and because you know how it operates, and this is how it's used as a probe. What you do is get it to interact with other processes, see if other processes affect it, etc., and then that will tell you something about those processes. So for example, because the Stroop effect is such a reliable probe about the automaticity of processing, Emir Raz was able to use the Stroop effect as a probe to recently provide some of the first clear evidence for the objective existence of hypnosis. Okay, how did he do that? Why is he a Canada Research Chair? Because what he did was hypnotize people and told them when they're looking through the words to not pay attention to the meaning of the words but only to the color. And you can't do that. You can't placebo that because of the automaticity of the Stroop effect. And what he was able to show reliably, replicated, right, many times, is that if people are properly hypnotized, they can significantly reduce the Stroop effect. There you go. So do you understand how a cognitive probe works? You go, wow, hypnosis must be real because it can really change the Stroop effect, and the Stroop effect is a real phenomenon. So he gets to become famous, and eventually he'll live in France. Okay. So she was doing the same thing, like Raz uses the Stroop effect to study hypnosis. She was using feeling of knowing to study insight. Okay, so feeling of knowing, and it's always pronounced, even though we have this acronym, it's always pronounced feeling of knowing for obvious reasons. You don't pronounce the acronym. Okay? It's always F-O-K, or feeling of knowing. Now here's the basic idea. First of all, what is feeling of knowing? Feeling of knowing is if I ask you something, and you can't currently answer me, you will often get a feeling that you nevertheless know it. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so there's quite a bit of research done on that, and there's been quite a bit of research done by the time Metcalfe was doing this experiment. That's actually an accurate thing you have. Your feeling of knowing is a quite good predictor of the fact that you will later be able to produce the needed information. So it's not like we get lots of feelings that don't track anything. Many of you know that your confidence in your memory is not a measure of how accurate it is. It's a measure of how meaningful it is. Right? So you're really confident, I know this, that's the person who shot Agnes, I swear. Turns out that's not the person. Okay? Because the reconstructive nature of memory, blah, blah, blah. You know all this. Okay? But, unlike that, unlike your confidence, which tracks how meaningful the information is to you rather than its accuracy, feeling of knowing is an accurate predictor. It's an accurate predictor that you will be able to, right? And it's reliable, it's robust. Okay, so that's one of the feelings you have good reason to trust, by the way. You should not trust your confidence in your memory, because it is not a tracker of accuracy. But you should trust your feeling of knowing, because we've got good evidence, reliable, replicated evidence, that it is predictive of your ability to actually recall the information. Yes?
Could you provide an example of that? I'm still not clear what you're... Or you're not talking about the tip of the tongue effect?
Tip of the tongue is one instance, but not all instances in where you have feeling of knowing, right, are tip of the tongue phenomena. Right. An example that I made a joke about, right, when I talked about you preparing for a test, is you will have studied something, you come in, you look at the material, you go, I know that, I know that, but your brain goes, not right now. You've had that happen to you, yes? Yeah. That's an example. It's not so much tip of the tongue, it's not like, what? right? But it's like, I know this, I know that I know this. But that's not the same as being able to actually produce it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so here was the idea. Yes?
What if, so you're saying, well, in terms of like confidence in memory being meaningful, like that's been documented, but what if your feeling of confidence in memory is related to your feeling of knowing?
It could be, but it doesn't seem to be that that's what it's generally tracking. So what people's experience is, I mean, you could train yourself is what you're saying.
No, I'm saying like what if in one instance, not like generally, but like what if you're saying, people are like, because I mean, you can say that you're confident that the lecturer said X, but at the same time it's because you have a feeling of knowing the semantic information that was provided.
Sure.
So,
So generally, yes. Generally, the feeling of, generally that's not the case, but I can't say to you that it's never the case, which is what you're asking me. But in the experiments in which people have been tested for the confidence, people will have very high confidence ratings, and they can't have a feeling of knowing because they actually will never. What you do is you, like for example, the classic one is you give people a bunch of dots, patterns. That's one, and then that's one, and then that's one, right? And then what you do is you show them a dot pattern that they have never been presented that represents the mathematical average of all the dot patterns that they've seen. They will be highly confident that they've seen it before, even though they never did. So they have not learned it, but they have a high confidence that they have seen it before. Because it's tracking how much previous information can be meaningfully integrated to make future predictions. Now, I can't do the opposite, which is what you want. Like, can I deny that in some instances the confidence might be deriving from feeling? No, I can't deny that. What hangs on that? Is there a point, or you just wanted to make that point? You're free to make the point. I just want to make sure I'm picking up on any implications.
I just was thinking that like sometimes you can be confident that you know something or that you remember something depending on the memory versus like the semantic versus episodic relationship.
There could be. I mean, feeling of knowing seems to be not the same thing as your confidence in the accuracy of what you have remembered.
Okay.
Okay. So, here's what Metcalfe's argument is. She's got this probe, and the feeling of knowing seems to be predictive of a successful memory search. Reliable predictor of successful memory search. Okay. So let's try and track her reasoning. Okay. Vervaeke successfully predicts that you're going to have a successful memory search. Now, Weisberg and Anova claim that that's all insight is, a successful memory search. So Weisberg and Anova are basically saying insight is successful memory search. That's what that stands for, successful memory search. And successful memory search is predicted, right, by Vervaeke. You following the argument so far? So what should Vervaeke be predictive of? Insight. Okay. So that's a straight prediction using the probe. You're going to see if insight is what Weisberg and Anova says, just the ability to complete a successful memory search, and feeling of knowing is predictive of that, then feeling of knowing should be predictive of insight. So what she did, right, is she gave people a standard memory task, feeling of knowing for a standard memory task, and then feeling of knowing for being given an insight problem. Okay? So you put people in a situation where they're in they have to remember something they currently can't remember. You get them to give their feeling of knowing rating, and then you see how predictive that is of them successfully remembering. You put them into an insight problem-solving situation that they can't currently solve. You can see the structural parallels here. And then you ask them to give a feeling of knowing that, like, will they be able to come up with an answer? Do they know the answer? Now, what she found, yes, Gita?
What's an insight problem?
An insight problem is a problem that requires, right, that you in some sense change the problem formulation in order to solve the problem. Okay? Now, part of what we're doing, Gita, is we're trying to work out more and more carefully what that is going to mean. Because one of my criticisms, of course, is that the Gestaltists have talked about this in relatively vague terms. Now, we have a couple of things we made progress on last time. I think necessary but not sufficient. Namely, there's two things that an insight problem does for you, and they could be together, they could be separate. One of the most important things is it changes a combinatorially explosive problem formulation into a non-combinatorially explosive problem formulation. And it might also be, or in alternative to, it might be changing an ill-defined problem into a well-defined problem. Is that okay? All right. So what did she find? Well, first of all, she replicates the cognitive probe. She finds that there was a high correspondence for memory. So people, again, feeling of knowing strongly predicts that people will successfully find in memory the needed information. The result for the insight problems was low. In fact, it was not statistically different from zero for insight problems. Okay? Now that's a pretty powerful disconfirmation of Weisberg and Alva's specific thesis that, insight problem solving is just a successful memory search. Which of course is why this experiment was done. Yes?
Can you repeat one sentence that you just said was?
There's a high correspondence for memory retrieval. So feeling of knowing, strong predictor that they will remember something that they can't currently find it in memory, but they will find it in memory.
And that relates to Weisberg and Alva, how?
Because Weisberg and Alva, remember, they proposed that all insight is, because insight doesn't actually exist, insight is just a memory search through the compartments.
Oh, so if there's anything that can probabilize success, then it must be something else.
Well, that's the implication of the conclusion, is that, now, let's be careful what Metcalf isn't saying. She's not saying that memory search is not involved in insight problem solving. That's ridiculous. And that's not an implication of the experiment. What she's saying is there must be something other than memory search involved in insight problem solving. That's what she's arguing. Okay, there has to be some other process at work in order to explain this very stark difference in the results. Okay, please remember that, okay, because one standard mistake people make, and students have made in the past, is they will take this as, and they will make the claim that this showed that memory search is not involved in insight. That is not what it is showing. It's showing that memory search, Weisberg and Alva's alternative, is insufficient to explain what's going on in insight. Some other kind of processing is at work. Yes?
Does feeling of knowing only predicts memory search?
Yes.
Predicts other stuff?
Yeah. And it got replicated in this experiment too.
But does it predict something other than this successful memory search?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what else it would predict. I don't know. I mean, you could randomly try seeing it what else, like your political allegiance or something like that. But the only theoretical motivation would be right now that I think that the way the construct is described would be towards memory search.
Because she's using feeling of knowing to say something about memory search. So what if feeling of knowing is action?
Okay, so but what she's relying on is that's the standard presentation, and so that's already independently asserted and confirmed empirically in the literature. And she replicates that again in the experiment, right? So it's legitimate for her to talk that way. Secondly, it's legitimate for her to talk that way because that's exactly the proposal of Weisberg and Alva as to what insight is. But your question is good. Do you see how, if you didn't know the theoretical debate though, you'd be missing a lot of what's going on in this experiment. You'd still get it in one sense, but a lot of what's going on in this experiment would be like, whoa, you wouldn't be getting it, okay? All right, so that was really interesting. That was really interesting. And like when this came out, it made a lot of noise, as it should, because it seemed to be, you know, a stark contrast to the Weisberg and Alba 1981 paper. Okay. So, Metcalfe followed this up. Am I not? Oh, there it is. So this is now Metcalfe 1986b. I'm not going to write it on the board. Just write Metcalfe again and put a B beside it. Okay. So Metcalfe was interested in the fact that feeling of knowing is very much like a snapshot. It's a end of the. It's sort of the. It's a one-shot sort of take on what's going on in cognition. So if you'll allow me to use a metaphor, she wanted to try and replace that snapshot with a film. She wanted a more online, moment-to-moment, or at least every 10-second measure of what's going on. So she wanted to turn the probe from a one-shot probe into a continuous probe. Is that right? Because she was she wanted to determine, like, how is this metacognitive, you know, awareness interacting with problem solving? It's obviously not a simple predictor of simple memory search. Okay. So, again, what she did is she went into the search inference framework to try and see if she could come up with, from the search inference framework, a theoretical motivation for a construct that would allow her to do what she wanted to do. And so what she's doing is she's basically going to replace feeling of knowing with a feeling of warmth. Okay, so she took a look at the work, and we've already done this, so I can remind you of it. She took at the work of Simon from the GPS, the general problem solver, and then Simon, and we talked a bit about this last time, admitted that the means-ends heuristic requires, right, something that is telling you if you're getting closer or farther away from your goal. And this is a direct quote from the work he wrote on that. He said, examination of path produces clues of the warmer, colder variety. And of course what he's alluding to there is the game warmer, colder, which it's not clear to me how and why that's a game. But you know what it's like. You put a bunch of people, you have to close your eyes, and people move around, and you say, warmer, colder, and then they eventually get to the object because they followed your warmer, colder instructions. Yay. Okay, so anyways, what Metcalfe theorized then is that people, as they're attempting to solve problems, right, are constantly, right, not just doing a one-shot feeling of knowing, they're constantly doing a feeling of warmth. Am I getting closer or farther away? Closer or farther away from my goal? Okay. So, I think this is very brilliant on Metcalfe's part. She wants to reformulate this, and she's in critical dialogue with the search inference framework. She doesn't just draw it out of thin air. She goes to the search inference framework itself in order to generate the new theoretical construct. So she's playing really, really rigorously, right? She's playing by the rules really, really clearly, really well. Okay. So, what she then decided to do, right, is to use this more ongoing processing probe while people were solving problems. So what she did is she gave the participants, were all attempting to solve purported insight problems. These are problems that had generally been called insight problems. Now we're going to come back to that. Gita has already brought up that this is a problematic notion. And I want to foreshadow that, is it really the case that something is intrinsically on its own an insight problem? Maybe that's something we should reflect on. We're going to come back to that point. The literature catches up. Sorry, we're speaking from the omniscience of hindsight. the literature is going to catch up with that and realize that that's an important issue. The person who actually is going to raise that question, because he keeps coming back, is Weisberg. Okay, so we're going to follow that debate out. So right now I'm asking you that that's a legitimate concern, put it on hold, because we're working towards it, okay? Because we're only still in 86, none of you even were born then, okay? Okay, so what Metcalfe does is give people purported insight problems to solve, and then they have to provide a warmth rating every 10 seconds. They have to provide a warmth rating every 10 seconds. Now remember what I said, this is the second experiment, and it won't be satisfying. Okay. So, there were two findings. Okay? And be careful, because they sound like they're contradictory, and they're not quite contradictory. They're not contradictory, but give me a chance to explain why not. First of all, the first finding is there's an abrupt increase in warmth ratings right before a solution is found. So, if you're looking at the ratings, they look like this, and then boom, just before the insight is found. Okay? Second, right? A strong feeling of warmth predicted failure to solve the problem rather than success. So although you get this right before solution, right, a strong feeling of warmth actually predicted failure to solve the problem rather than success. Now, what you have to remember is to distinguish rate from difference. This is a sudden, graphically sudden. Here's where we're not trying to be, you know, is it graphical or phenomenological? Okay. It's at least graphically sudden, right, which might be different from just an overall high feeling of warmth rating, like, right, like this, right from the beginning. Okay. So don't confuse rate with difference. Those two findings are not in contradiction to each other. In fact, the rate issue seems to be more predictive than the overall amount of warmth. So Metcalfe said that this was a confused result, because it's like, what's going on here? This is confusing, right? So what she argued is, in these situations where there's a very strong feeling of warmth overall, but it doesn't predict success, she speculated that people are satisficing. Okay, so this is a good opportunity to teach a concept we're going to need in the course as well. Okay, satisficing. Okay, this is a notion drawn from, again, Newell and Simon. Okay. I'll say, what do you do in satisficing? Satisficing is you'll take let's say you want to reach a goal, right? But getting to that goal is very hard, very difficult. What you do in satisficing is you settle for a goal that's somewhat similar to the actual goal that you wanted, but that is easier to get to. Okay? That's satisficing. Satisficing is you're going to go for this goal, but that's really hard. So you weaken your goal to this, which is easier to do, and then you are satisfied with that lesser goal. And you'll probably realize that this can explain a lot of your dating behavior. Yes?
Couldn't it also be that people who have like this strong feeling of warmth all the way through just be formulating the problem wrong from the very beginning and are thinking that they're doing it right?
That's what she's saying with satisficing.
Oh, okay.
That's exactly
Okay.
that's exactly what they're doing. But the problem with an insight problem is there's a specific answer. So if you formulate it this way and you move towards that, you think, oh, I'm going to get there, and then you don't actually get there.
But it's not that the people are consciously saying, okay, I don't know how to solve this problem,
No.
I'll move towards this solution which I do know how to
Right.
solve. Okay.
Now, some of them might be doing what you're saying. And the point is, for her argument, it doesn't really matter. Because what she's worried about is there's a confound here. Namely, she has not controlled how people are approaching these problems. She hasn't controlled for that variable. Yes?
Are there people who exhibit both kind of curves? So they would,
For the same, you mean across different problems?
not for the same problem. So they would start off really high, and then they would realize that they are on the
Oh,
wrong
so
path.
let me make sure I'm drawing this. So they're like this, and then they go down like this, and then it
Yeah.
goes like that?
Exactly.
There might be. I don't know if she reports that specifically or separately. I don't believe she does. Why did you ask that? That's intriguing.
I just thought that maybe people would like come to realize that they, that despite their feeling of one, that they aren't actually progressing in the right way. So they would report that they actually are getting colder just before the insight.
That's good, yeah. I honestly don't remember. I haven't looked at the primary data in a long time. So that might be something to, I don't believe it's in the discussion or any of the write-up for the experiment. Yes?
Wouldn't like the graph that you just drew kind of be like for the 9-dot problem? Because we don't, like, when we talked about inside problems in the last lecture, we talked about how it appears easy, so we feel like we can solve it, but then later on we realize that it's impossible.
Sure, it might be. I guess, in fact, there's sort of an a priori argument there that all inside problems might have some initial, like, high value. I guess the question is about its duration and its impact. So that's a good question. I mean, that's a good question that should be actually, I think, empirically investigated, even using this sort of design paradigm. Yes?
Well, wouldn't the level of like warmth just be correlated to whether the person thinks they have an answer, basically? So if they think they know the answer, then they'll get warm. If they don't, then they'll be cold, basically.
That's right, that's what it's measuring.
Yeah.
So I think what he was suggesting, what's your name?
Q.
Q? I think what he was suggesting is, like in a lot of insight problems, people initially think they know the answer, then they realize they don't. And then if they solve it, they get this spike at the end. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, no, I was kind of more so saying, like, not so much that example, but more so like it depends more so on the subject. Because whether like the subject believes that they're knowledgeable about that, would determine the actual graph itself. Like, if you kind of see like you're.
I'm not quite seeing, I mean, because these people, I mean, this is not tracked.
Yeah, because that doesn't actually track the, like, whether the answer is right? It's like, that basically tracks like their belief that the answer is right.
Right, they're feeling
So depending on if the subject believes that their answer is right, whether it's right or not, that would show the graph more so than actual like accuracy of the answer.
Sure, but the problem is this graph doesn't predict success and this does.
Okay, so that one actually does predict like a lot of high number of success.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So if it was just what you were saying, there wouldn't be a difference in the success of the two, right? But what she wanted to know was why like turn it around, not to twist your words or anything, but both of these are sort of giving strong ratings towards the end. Why are these people largely inaccurate and these people are largely accurate?
Okay.
And so what she's speculating is that because these people are satisficing, as Becky?
Yeah.
That they're misrepresenting the problem to themselves. They're misformulating the problem. Did that address your question? Okay, great. Good. This is it. See, theoretical debate mixed up with experimental competition. I love this stuff. Okay, so what was needed was, what we've got to do is try to control for, and here's where the experimental competition and the theoretical debate are going to keep hammering against each other, right? It's like, well, what we've got to do is control for this so that people will treat, right, some problems as insight problems and only as insight problems. Okay? Now again, that goes back to Gina's question about, well, but what is an insight problem? And does it objectively exist? Now Metcalfe sort of does what people often do, which is legitimate for a while, is she sort of did an experimental hack around that theoretical problem. And I think it was cool that she did it because it was needed to be done, and it was an idea that keeps getting picked up. What she did, was she ran the third experiment. So this is Metcalfe. And I don't know how it's pronounced. BB, Weib, I don't know, I've never heard it, 1987.
I know a lot of them, they're called weebs.
Pardon me?
I know a lot of weebs.
You know a lot of, like, and it's written this way, and it's pronounced weeb? Let's go with weeb then. We have at least some empirical evidence. Okay, so what she did was to try, she got insight problems, and then she got non-insight problems. She had people try to solve both, and then give feeling of warmth ratings for both. So she's trying to pull these two apart. How did she pick up non-insight problems? What she did was she found well-defined problems that have been analyzed and modeled by programs using the means-ends heuristic. She went in and said, well, what kind of problems does the means-ends heuristic do well at? Again, she's using the search inference framework itself. So these are the kinds of problems that the means-ends heuristic does well at. I'm going to use them as my model for, notice, many of you are nodding, that's correct. There's an intuition there that's good. This is not the same thing as giving a theoretical explication though, right? Okay, so she goes in and she says, basically, what we're going to do is we're going to have, this is how I'm going to operationalize non-insight problems. I'm going to find the problems that have traditionally been, well, I'm going to tell people, right, to solve them and give feeling of warmth ratings, and then I'm going to compare these two. Okay, so, you know, control group, pulling apart a confound, you know this. This is how you do good science. And like I say, this is a good experimental hack. The intuition is clear. You understand why it makes sense. And it's fair because she's taking the notion from the search inference framework itself. So she's not just, you know, pulling it out of thin air. But ultimately, she has not answered Gita's question as to, yes, but what is an insight problem, and are there problems that are intrinsically insight problems? Okay, I'm not going to keep hammering on that point because I made it clear that it's going to be addressed and it's important. Is that okay? All right, so what were the predictions? There were two predictions. So, let's just get clear on the names. What we'll talk about. Okay, so this is an incremental curve. It goes up incrementally. All right. And this is an abrupt curve. Is that all right? Okay, I don't think anything more is needed for that. So the first prediction was an incremental versus an abrupt warmth pattern for non-insight versus insight. So the idea is this is what people would give for non-insight, and this is what people would give for insight. Bless you. Second prediction, you'd have accurate metacognition for non-insight problems, whereas you would not have that for insight problems. So now she's going back and trying to gather what was also in the first 86 thing. Okay? So the idea is, this is going to, right? This is going to be accurate and inaccurate. This is not the same thing as whether or not people solve the problem, like in the second experiment. This is accurate about people's predictions about how they're going to do. Okay? All right, so take a look at this. Does this make sense? Okay? So basically what she's saying is feeling of warmth and feeling of knowing, ultimately, work for non-insight problems. Because they are probably mostly standard memory search. They're not going to work for insight problems, and you're going to get this sudden abrupt change precisely because something other than standard memory search is going on. And both of those predictions were well confirmed. Both of those predictions were well confirmed. Yes?
Have they ever done this research with people who have like previously been exposed to the specific insight problems that they're testing?
It depends. Different insight problems have different, so I have to be careful here because I don't want to talk like it's an intrinsic property of the problem. In general, what happens is there's a wide variation on ability to remember the solution to a problem. Okay, and there's a complex answer to that, and it has to do about how insight problems and memory are interacting. Because obviously the relationship between insight and memory is not a clear-cut, straightforward relationship. So there's an answer coming.
Okay.
Is that okay? Yes.
Why did you write accurate and accurate for
Accurate and inaccurate?
Yeah.
This is their ability to predict that they're going to solve the problem versus this. All right, so now the first thing happens, well, the first thing that you want to happen is replication. And as you know, we've talked a lot about this for a very long time, and we didn't do it very much, which is why psychology is going through a replication crisis right now. But this is one of those things for which there was good replication. And it was replication that made a theoretical advance. Yes?
I'm kind of confused, because isn't the one that's insight accurate for, like, insight problems?
Yeah, but if you ask people along the way, right, most of their predictions, they'll say, I'm not gonna be able to solve it, I'm not gonna be able to solve it, I'm not gonna be able to solve it. You ask people here, I'm gonna be able to solve it. And so you get a lot more accurate predictions than you do here.
Wait, but isn't that inaccurate? Because they're wrong about being able to solve it.
No, they solve all these, they solve the problem.
Oh, they solve the non-insight.
This is not, yeah, these are non-insight
Oh.
problems that are solved in memory. That's what I meant. This is not the same graphs as in the second experiment. She's pulling the two things apart.
Okay, I understand.
Sorry for that. Okay, so, let's get back to it. All right, yes?
Just to speak here though, for these graphs that they're measuring is like the metacognitive prediction of how close are you to the solution, right? Not binary, will you solve it?
But there's also the metacognitive report, will you solve this problem or not? And then you're also you're giving ratings, but you're also asked, are you going to solve this problem or not? So, here's a plausible thing, that when it's like this, there's a thing in you that can easily extrapolate that you're probably going to come to a solution. Thing in you, whereas there isn't such a thing here. Okay? Is that okay for now?
Just a clarification about exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
So in an insight problem, your feeling of warmth doesn't work.
Only until the very end.
But at the
Because when it suddenly goes up here, people start to say, oh, I am going to solve this, and they turn out to be right.
right. So that it's not like they just don't have a feeling of warmth at the beginning? Like
It's
the
very
insight
low,
problem
very
doesn't-
minimal, yeah.
So the insight problem doesn't induce that feeling of, I have this in my brain?
That's right,
somewhere?
yeah,
Okay, until then.
until then. That's exactly what the graph is showing.
Okay.
Is that just a clarification question?
Yes.
Okay.
Got it now.
Emma?
It's because like solving a non-insight problem is more like solving a math problem, or could be solving a math problem. And you're like going through the proof in your head, and you're like, okay, so I'm like 3/4 of the way through the steps, and you can see that as you go along.
That's right.
Whereas an insight problem, you don't know what's going on, and you're just sort of searching in the darkness.
That's right.
Okay.
But what we want to do is we want to get beyond what you did. It's fair enough for your question. What we don't want, our theory is, what happens is you search the darkness.
Yeah.
Okay? So, and notice, again, that's bound up with Gita's question about, well, what do we actually mean when we're calling something an insight problem? And again, we're working towards that because we're doing theoretical debate, experimental competition, right? And it's going to take us like 7 lectures to get close to what's going on in insight. And it should be hard. Because if the argument so far is right, the process by which restructuring and problem formulation is being like manipulated is the core of your problem solving ability.
Isn't that kind of like a circular definition for an insight problem though? Because it's like you're basically just saying an insight problem is a problem where you have insight.
Well, that's part of what we're saying where we don't have an independent way of talking about it. It's not quite circular in that what you're saying is there is something that people call insight problems that seems to be processed differently than other regular problems. And now I want to show you the replication because the replication adds to that sense of difference, okay? So, there's a sense in which, and we've talked about this, we already talked about it in the discussion about like things like competence. This is all, you know, this is the universal pejorative term that really isn't well thought out, but it's applied. This is very subjective. Okay. So the thing is, like people are reporting something, but does it actually reflect any kind of difference in processing? Well, again, they don't have the machinery back then to look at the brain very carefully. But what happened was a couple of interesting studies. So Vervaeke did this in 1989, versions of this, 1994. Vervaeke, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. And I don't know these researchers other than this work, 1995. So basically 3 studies. And what they did was they set up the same experiment, right, where you have people solving non-insight problems, insight problems. You have people giving the feeling of warmth ratings, but then they were also measuring heart rate. They're measuring heart rate. Because typically heart rate actually reflects, metabolic differences in processing, et cetera, et cetera. Right? It might reflect other things, but you're going to look for how tightly the heart rate, for example, is tracking the feeling of warmth. Because if the heart rate is actually reflecting, has high, you know what concordance means, right? The 2 graphs, and if I were to put them one on top of the other, they would closely superimpose, yeah? If I have high concordance, that means that the heart rate is actually measuring, there's something actually physiological going on that corresponds to feeling of warmth. That's what they found. They found those 2 things. They found for the non-insight problems, heart rate went like this, and for the insight problems, it went like that. And then they also found that these heart rate graphs had high concordance with the feeling of warmth graphs. So first of all, they replicated in 3 studies Metcalfe's original experiment, which is good. And then secondly, in 3 studies, they were able to show that there's something objective going on with feeling of warmth. There's different processing occurring in some sense, because it's showing up in, a highly concordant physiological measure. Okay, so that impressed people. All this sets of things, so it's like something's going on. The Weisberg and Alba claim that there's nothing going on in insight is now becoming implausible. Okay, that's something's going on. It's not standard memory search. It's even making a physiological difference. This feeling of warmth difference is real in some objective sense. So what is the difference? What's going on? We can't just say there's nothing different or special about insight. Okay. We're going to take a look now at another set of experiments. And once again, I'm going to, as we go through the experiment, we'll look at it, but I'm also going to point out a looming theoretical flaw in the experiment. Just like the issue about the objectivity of an insight problem is a looming issue. By the way, although this hasn't been brought up, a related issue, which Weisberg is also going to point out, is whether or not the class of things we call insight problems is homogeneous or not. Okay? So we're going to come back to both of those. The next series of experiments have to do with, right, the relationship between insight and verbal overshadowing. Okay? Now, here's my theoretical forewarning, and we're going to come back to this. Some of you know this from 250, because I do this argument more extensively in College 250. Even though this term shows up in textbooks, I think verbal overshadowing is a horrible theoretical mongrel. And I'm going to come back and, I think, very seriously criticize it as a construct. Nevertheless, I want to go through the experiments because they show important things. Okay? So, the experiments are going to rely a lot in terms of on this notion of verbal overshadowing. I'm going to come back later and say that the notion that the overshadowing is done by something verbal, I'll show you along the way why that's misleading. Language itself is not an interference effect, right? And then the notion of overshadowing implies a model of attention that is overly simplistic and does not capture what is needed to understand what's going on in insight. All you need to do right now is just put a pin in verbal overshadowing. Vervaeke is going to come back later and destroy it. experiment I want to talk, the series of experiments have to do with work done by Schuler, who has been an advocate for verbal overshadowing. The first one is from Schuler, Olson, and Brooks from 1993. The publication dates and the production dates for this data do not track, which is a little bit weird. When things were published and when they were actually done doesn't track. Okay, so the first one is Schuler, Olson, and Brooks. 1993. Okay, so what they were basically doing is they were making use of Metcalfe's difference between people solving insight problems and non-insight problems. And then they're going to eventually zero in on what they're going to call an individual differences methodology, which I'll also teach you about. What was happening in this study is they were comparing the effects of concurrent verbalization on solving insight problems and solving non-insight problems. Okay, first of all, what's concurrent verbalization? Concurrent verbalization, this is where the notion of verbal overshadowing comes from. Concurrent verbalization is as you're trying to solve a problem, you're speaking aloud. You're giving, writing protocol analysis, basically, right, of what you're doing. What's going on in your mind? What are you doing as you're trying to solve the problem? You're doing concurrent verbalization. Now, they did a series of studies. And what they found was that concurrent verbalization markedly impairs insight problem solving. It really impairs insight problem. It's not just that in insight words fail you, and sometimes words cause you to fail. Right? Whereas concurrent verbalization had no effect on non-insight problem solving. So you seem to get a reliable difference on interference between insight, where you get a lot, and non-insight problems where you're getting very little from concurrent verbalization. Now, two things come to mind that are going on in this experiment. One, right, which I think is what they're sort of thinking, and it's plausible. I'm not saying they're saying something implausible, right, is that, insight is largely an ineffable process, and therefore speaking might somehow interfere with insight. Because if I ask you how you have an insight, you'll go, well, I didn't have an insight, and then I did. That will be your explanation, right? Right? We're going to come back to this leaping in insight. Now I think that's at sort of the level they were talking about it. But there might be something else going on, and this is again to foreshadow what we're going to talk about later, that lines up with what we talked about when we criticized, right, Weisberg and Anova, or where Domanowski criticized them, which is the idea that insight may be much more of a procedural process than a propositional process. It might not be verbalization versus ineffability. It might be that insight is a very procedural process that can be interfered with by propositional processing. In fact, one of the best ways to interrupt people's procedural abilities is to get them to go into propositional processing. So if you're sparring with somebody, I'm a martial artist, a good thing to do is to say, wow, that was a really good move, how did you do that? And then they'll try to answer you and then they fall apart. They can't spar anymore. Or if I were to ask you to tell me what you're doing while you're writing your notes, what you're doing with your hand in order to do it, yes?
Sorry, was this the argument of Schuler, Olson, and Brooks, or
No.
someone else?
This is an argument that I'm making, and I'm making this argument to try and foreshadow, to give you some tools for getting a little bit of alternative ways of thinking about their interpretation of the results. So they're presenting this very much as it's just the verbal overshadowing. There might be something going on there. Another way of me putting this to you is it language use per se that's causing the interference, which is what they're asserting, Or is it that certain types of language use trigger certain kinds of processing? Right? Is it language use per se that's the interference? Or is it that certain kinds of language use trigger certain kinds of processing, and those kinds of processing might be the interfering effects? There's a difference between those two hypotheses, right? Okay, that's all I need you to get right now. Sorry, I'm not bullying you.
No, of course not, that's good.
Okay, okay. Okay, great. All right, so there is something going on here. They interpret it in terms of verbal overshadowing. I'm suggesting there might be something else going on in terms of type of processing. We'll come back to that later. Okay. So Schuler and Melcher, 1995, you have all these protocol analyses, like you have, right, all these protocol analyses you can do, right, because you have all of these reports that people have given. So Schuler and Melcher in 95, like I said, I'm presenting this in terms of the logic of the studies. Okay. So they compared the non-insight and insight protocols. Okay. So the non-insight protocols contained a significantly greater proportion of what they called arguments. What they mean by that are inferential strategies like logic, means, ends analysis. There's very little use of inferential strategies in the insight protocols. So what we're seeing is lots of inferential strategies here, not very many here. Okay? Yes?
What do you mean by inferential strategy?
So using logic,
Oh.
right, using math, using means ends heuristic, using anything where you're checking the logical relations between propositions in order to try and advance you to getting to the goal state. So one way you can try to move from an initial state to the goal state is by moving logically between propositional representations of states. But that might not be the only way you could move to your goal state. And of course, it's not primarily the way you move to your goal state when you're doing something procedural. Is that okay for now?
Yes.
Great. I forget your name.
Ainsley?
Ainsley. Okay, now, the reverse, there was a reverse where you found something in insight protocols that you didn't find very much in non-insight protocols. Much higher proportion of pauses and metacognitive reports for insight protocols. So people are much more often pausing, right? I'm not doing, they're just like nothing's happening. And they're doing metacognitive reports. They're reporting on what's going on in their mind. So there's a shift in insight, right, onto of attention onto the cognitive medium, rather than just onto the problem itself. People are actually paying attention to the cognitive medium. They're stepping back and looking at it rather than looking through it. So if you'll allow me an analogy that I'm going to come back to later when we talk about mindfulness. So this is an analogy. It is an analogy. It is an analogy. It's an aid to understanding. And we're going to come back to this idea later. Right? Right now, I am looking through my glasses, in both senses of the word, beyond them and by means of them. And I'm specifically invoking both senses of the word. I'm looking through my glasses, because that's actually what's happening. I'm looking beyond them, and I'm looking by means of them. Is that okay? Now sometimes, right, I've been wearing glasses since I was 1. I've been wearing glasses a long time. And I can't get contacts, and I can't do the laser surgery because of specific sort of weird defects in my eyes. So glasses and the eye are going to be together until I die. But sometimes what I have to do, right, is, right, I do this. Right now that my glasses are transparent, I'm looking through them, but sometimes I step back and I adjust my attentional focus, which in this case is also a perceptual focus, right, a visual focus I mean. I adjust my focus so I'm looking at my glasses rather than looking through them. Does that make sense? I'm not looking through them, I'm stepping back and looking at them. And this allows me to pay attention to what's actually going on in the medium, right? And I can do things like clean my glasses. And then of course when I put them back on, right? I can see differently through them than before. So what I'm suggesting to you is that's what's happening. People are engaging in something like a core process of mindfulness. They're stepping back and looking at the cognitive medium, what's going on in their mind, rather than looking through those processes directly at the problem. Yes?
How do they know that this is what's happening?
Pardon me?
How do they know that they are doing this?
Because they're giving metacognitive reports. They're saying what's going on in their mind, rather than talking about properties or features of a problem. Yes?
So the experiment involves a prompt, right? And then it's just a matter of the type of feedback you get?
The prompt, the only prompt is, tell me what you're doing
Okay.
from beginning to end. So there's an initial prompt, and then you're just let run. And then what they're doing is they're looking through all of these protocols. This is everything that people have said, and looking for what was present in one and absent in the other. So the first difference, and first of all, we haven't even determined if it's predictive or not. What people are saying they're doing and what they're doing aren't necessarily the same thing. Okay? The first, prima facie, what we see is there's a difference. Lots of inferential processing going on in the non-insight problems, and there seems to be this transparency opacity shift, this kind of metacognitive directing of attention at the cognitive medium rather than through it in insight problems. A plausible, like at least initially plausible speculation, which we will then have to try and turn into theoretical argument and empirical evidence, is that people are stepping back and trying to look at how they're formulating the problem rather than looking at the formulation, the formulated problem. Okay? They're trying to step back and look at their problem formulation, how they're formulating the problem, rather than at the formulated problem. Okay, so as I mentioned before, what people say they're doing and what they're doing, right, are not the same thing. This is why introspectionism died as the main way of trying to do psychology right before the behaviorists, because introspection is shitty. Sorry, it's crappy. Introspection does not work well, because what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing can be very different. This is, by the way, why you shouldn't ignore it, but you should always question any evidence that is that's produced by self-report questionnaire. Because all you're getting access to is people's introspectively available information, which can be completely other than what they're doing or what's actually generating their performance. Okay. Yes?
Are those things type specific?
What do you mean? Like, are there types of things for which introspection is generally more accurate than others?
Well, types in which introspection is more accurate than other types, but also, like, if you ask someone who is, like, missing a limb, like, oh, what's it like, how do you walk without a limb, and they introspect and they think and they write it down, like, I feel like that would be pretty accurate because they've lived with that versus someone asking, like, how do you solve an insight problem, which is, like, not the same. Like, through lived experiences, you know how often that is different. Like, it's a feeling of knowing because, like, you know your experiences versus, like, something you think but doesn't work because your feeling of knowing doesn't apply in that situation.
Yeah, I don't know if I have enough knowledge to answer your question. My concern is that generally if things are introspectable, that means they're being held in working memory. And since a lot of your processing a lot of the time is going on outside of working memory, that even when you might be accurate to some degree, it's still going to be quite misleading. I mean, there's a sense in which I agree with you though, because I mean, if what I want to do experiments on are people's awareness of like their conscious experience, then of course introspection is going to be in fact the only mechanism I have if I want to study that. But for example, asking you to introspect while you're doing language processing turns out to be largely useless, because most of that processing, all that syntax and all that stuff, is going on largely unconsciously. Even though you're very familiar with language use, you do it all day long. So, sorry, that's not a conclusive answer, but it's an honest one. from what people say to finding out if what they say predicts their success. Because if what they're saying they're doing is actually tightly correlated with their success, then it is plausible that it is actually what they're doing in order to produce their success. Okay, so what they did was they checked the degree to which problem elements, arguments, what I'm calling inferential processes, or pauses or metacognitive reports, are predictive of the success for both types of problems. So for non-insight problems, use of inferential processing was highly correlated with success. So for non-insight problems, the use of inferential processes was highly predictive of success. So when people say they're doing this inferentially, they're doing it inferentially, and that's what's actually getting them to the goal state. For insight problems, there was no correlation, zero, between the use of inferential processes and success. There was no correlation. In fact, and this is going to push to the second experiment, right? There was very little that predicted success in insight problems. There's very little in the protocol analysis that predicted it. There's a weak correlation between pausing and success in insight problems. That might be, like I say, when people are sort of trying to disengage from the problem. Step back. Okay, so again, we seem to see that there's very, very computational processes going on in insight problems. Not good evidence that that's going on in non-insight problems. Now, one temptation here, I'm just going to briefly say what it is, and then we'll take a break. One temptation is like if you're in the search inference framework, is to say, aha, but it's actually computational for both. It's just that in insight, the computational processes are going by so fast, right, that they escape verbalization and consciousness. This is known as the speeded reasoning view. That for both sets of problems, you're using these computational processes, but for insight, right, it's happening so fast, so rapidly, that it can't be brought into language and consciousness. This is the speeded reasoning view. Before we come break, and we'll come back after the break and talk about the the empirical response to that. First of all, think about it in terms of its theoretical plausibility. Now you need an independent theory as to why, when you go into insight problems, you do this speeded up inferential processing. And why you don't do it for non-insight problems. Secondly, it has not been the case that as we have produced machines that get faster and faster at unconscious inferential processing, they have become more insightful in their problem-solving abilities. And you are using such machines right now. So, it's an implausible hypothesis to begin with. And then as we're going to see, it's going to receive empirical disconfirmation, the speed of reasoning. Within subject design, and I think they also had a between subject design, between the various studies. But because you have a within subject design, you can check how people are doing on both the insight and the non-insight problems. So, if both types of problems use the same processes, if both the non-insight problems and the insight problems are both using your inferential processes, right, then success on non-insight problems should be predictive of success on insight problems. If you're using the same machinery and all that you're doing is speeding it up in insight, then there should be a predictive relationship between success with that machinery for non-insight problems and success for, right, using that machinery on insight problems. Right? So what they did is they looked for, when people were solving these problems, right, and they're using the inferential processes for the non-insight problem, does their success on the non-insight problems correlate with their success on the insight problems? What's the degree of the correlation between them? And the degree of the correlation between them was none. There's no correlation. So it's both an implausible thesis and it doesn't receive empirical confirmation. So the question then emerges, what kinds of processes, if inferential processes are not predictive of insight problem solving, what kind of processes are? So this goes to work by Melcher, but this is 1993 when they did it. They used what they called an individual differences methodology. An individual differences methodology. So let's talk about process A and skill B. Sorry, I should always forewarn you when I'm going to do that. It does sound like a hand grenade going on, which is unpleasant. Okay, so I'm going to look for, I'm going to examine empirically some process. So I've got some process A, and then I'm seeing if it's a component to skill B. So what we can do is you can see if process A, the reasoning goes like this, if process A is involved, is a causal factor in skill B, then performance on tasks involving A should be predictive of tasks requiring skill B. So you're trying to figure out what are the processes at work in this. And I'd say, oh, I think this process is at work in this. If that's the case, then performance on this should be predictive of how well you do in this. Does everybody understand the reasoning? Okay. So what they wanted to do was, what they did was give a bank of tests, and we're going to see people are going to start repeatedly using this individual differences methodology. They're going to give a bank of tests to see which processes are predictive of insight problem solving as an attempt to try and get clear about what are the elements within it. What are the component processes within insight problem solving? So another way of putting that is the individual difference methodology is a method of trying to analyze a process down into more basic processes. Trying to analyze the skill, I'm using that word because it's of the potential that insight is procedural in nature, into its component skills. Okay, so they considered 3 potential insight processes. Restructuring, I'll tell you how they operationalize each one of these in a minute. Field independence and unconscious search. Okay, so field independence is when you're doing a disembedding task and you're saying, what the heck are you talking about? How many of you have played as a kid or you have younger children in your lives who have to do Where's Waldo? How many of you know at least what I'm talking about when I talk about Where's Waldo? Okay, good. Okay. Why is it hard to find Waldo? Like if there was this is not a fun book. Wide Open Tundra, Waldo. There's Waldo. Okay? Why is it hard to find Waldo?
There are lots of other people.
There's lots of other people, right? There's lots of ways that, well, there's lots of things around Waldo that seem to have some of Waldo's features, but not all of Waldo's features, so you're potentially distracted. So it's embedded. And what you have to do is you have to learn how to, right, you have to do something so that Waldo stands out. Last one is unconscious search. And that's the idea that somehow you're connecting things that are not directly connected unconsciously. All right, so how did they operationalize these? Yes?
I feel like you only said two.
Uh,
Field, independence, unconscious.
Restructuring, field independence, and unconscious search. You're welcome. Yes?
Sorry, how does field independence relate to Waldo again?
When you're trying to find Waldo, you're doing a field independence task. You're trying to make Waldo independent from his field. You're trying to say, there's Waldo, I can see him, right? He's no longer embedded in the field of like people and distractors. I was just using it because it's the most common version of a field independence task that we've decided to make a cultural thing. It's one of the things that binds us together as a culture. Things like Waldo and Star Wars and stuff like that. That's what we stand for. Okay. Okay, so they tested restructuring. This is really clever. They tested restructuring by giving people out-of-focus pictures. So I'll give you an out-of-focus picture, and then you can do even better versions of that now. But I give you an out-of-focus picture, and you do something. It's really cool. People will do this. Well, I look at it, and I sort of, oh, that's Abraham Lincoln. Okay. Now, you probably know that you can now do that. You can do this even better because of just being out of focus. You can do like really coarse pixelation of a picture. And then you sort of look at it, and then you can sort of do this thing in your head. And you go, oh, that's actually blah. Okay? Now, there's ones that seem to combine them that are really cool. Right? So you'll look at a picture and it's just a bunch of colored splotches, purple and red and all kinds of, and you stare at it for a while and all of a sudden it goes 3D and it's a 3D picture of a porpoise jumping out of the ocean. How many of you have done those? How many, okay, how many of you have done those and you can't get it to work? Okay, so we're going to have to take you away. Okay, so it's interesting about when it works and when it doesn't work and what that's predictive of and not predictive of. Okay? All right. So, how did they do the field disembedding? They just gave people variations on like where's Waldo, right? So they did an embedded figures test. You have all these lines, and you have to sort of, oh, can you see the three-dimensional square? Oh, there it is, there. Okay. They did three things for the unconscious search. They did a remote associate task. So, a word that all three of those are associated with. Blackboard, oh. So those are called remote associate tasks, which has the wonderful acronym, a RAT task. Okay, so there's games out on the market now that you can actually play this. There's a game called Tribond where you have to do this. Given three things and you have to say, what do they all have in common? Okay? Then there's, now interestingly, how this has gotten taken up into the general literature, I think is a little bit confused, but we'll come back to that. Then there's category instance generation. So I give you a category. Okay, so I'm going to give you a category, the category of gems. The first one is diamond. Quickly, give me two other category members. Gems. The first one is diamond. Give me two more. Shout some out. Come on. Emeralds, rubies, sapphires. Okay. And those are the cream. The ones that come up first are the ones that you should buy for your significant other. If they don't come up very quickly, don't buy that. It's a good heuristic. Topaz. No. Okay. And then the last one, which I think other people argue should be thrown out because it's terrifically confounded, is anagrams. They're using this as an unconscious search. Anagram is when you have a word and it's mixed up and you have to reorganize it. That seems to be a mixture of all kinds of these other tasks. It seems to be confounded. It's not just a memory search, right? You have to restructure, you're doing some field disembedding, you're doing possibly some remote associate. So the anagram should just be thrown out there. It's confounded and confused. Okay. All right, so now what we have is we have a bunch of things. Yes?
I'm sorry, can you just repeat the name of the second task?
The name of the second task is a category instance generation. So you have to generate instances from a category. All right, so, yes?
Sorry, all of those are under unconscious search.
Yeah. All right, so let's keep going. So, perceptual restructuring turned out to be the single best predictor of insight performance. The better people are on perceptual restructuring, the better they are at solving insight problems. Now, whether or not it's perceptual restructuring is probably a bit of a mistake, because a lot of problems can be posed to you in an abstract form, and you can still solve them. So it might be attentional restructuring that we're actually talking about. Right. We may be measuring something more basic, like cognitive flexibility. So don't lean too much on the perceptual part of this. But what's going on here is that this is, your ability to do this is a very good predictor of how you'll do on insight problems. Your ability to do that weird attentional thing where you redistribute what's salient, what's foreground, what's background, all that, seems to be predictive. Well, we've got evidence to suggest that it's predictive of your insight ability. Second best is field independence task. Being able to find Waldo really well is actually predictive of how good you are in solving insight problems. Now, it's not clear that that's causal, in the sense that if you do Waldo all day long, you'll get better at solving insight problems. That's something we'll have to ask later. Now, remote associate task was predictive of insight, but much less than field independence and restructuring. Now, here's why I wanted to stop and flag this for a sec. This does predict insight. Clearly, that's what the evidence shows. But it's a much weaker predictor than field disembedding or perceptual restructuring. Now, why is Vervaeke going on about this? Because many researchers use this as the test for insight problem solving, which is somewhat problematic. Why are they using this one when the other two are more predictive of insight problem solving? Yes?
Easier?
Probably easier. Okay, so, and that's a real thing, right? Ease of experimental design is a real thing in science. So I'm not ridiculing, you understand? What I'm doing is setting in a reminder for you when you read this that this isn't the best. Okay, it's not theoretically the best. It may be methodologically easier to use, but that doesn't mean it is necessarily getting clearly at the central functions of insight. Okay? Just remember that. Okay, category generation, like I said, we're going to throw out anagrams. Category generation was not predictive of insight success. Again, seeming to confirm that searching through the compartments is not the primary thing you do in order to solve an insight problem. So yet another refutation, well, sorry, an empirical disconfirmation of the Weisberg and Alba theory of how you do insight. Okay, so category generation, searching the category box is not predictive of insight. Now what's interesting is it goes the other way. The perceptual restructuring and embedded figures tasks are not predictive of non-insight problem solving. Your ability to do perceptual restructuring, your ability to find Waldo, is not predictive of how well you will solve non-insight problems. generation, as well as other inferential processing measures such as MAT scores, which do not predict insight, do predict success on non-insight problems. So what you're basically getting is the processes that predict success on insight do not predict success on non-insight, and vice versa. You're getting something close to a double dissociation. Okay, which is pretty good evidence. It's not conclusive, but it's pretty good evidence that you've got different processes at work. In fact, Schuller and Melcher come to a conclusion that's almost as strong as Weisberg and Anova. And it's amazing how these two, like, they're the direct opposite, but they're both, this is what they say. The two types of processes draw on the two types of problems draw on qualitatively different processes. Now, I'm going to argue later, I think theoretically they've got it the wrong way around, but nevertheless, you understand what they're saying, that the processing that's going on for insight problems seems to be very different than the processing going on in non-insight problems. What I mean by the other way around is I think we have different problem-solving processes, and when we use one, we call it insight, and when we use the other, we call it non-insight. Okay. All right. So we'll come back to, again, the issue of verbal overshadowing when we come back and we take a look at some of Weisberg's theoretical responses to this empirical work. Because again, science is driven both by empirical, experimental competition and theoretical debate. And I'm trying to show you how they weave back and forth through each other. Part of the reason I'm doing that, of course, is part of my pedagogical responsibility is not only to teach you the material, but to teach you how to be a good scientist. Because in the end, the second thing is more important to you. Right now, the content stuff is more important to you because it means your mark, and your mark means your degree, and your degree means possibly your job, and your job means whether or not people will eat with you and reproduce with you, right? But, right, I get that, and so that's why I'm trying to teach you a lot of the relevant content. But down the road, a lot of this content is going to be overturned or found to be obsolescent or misframed. This is what the history of science shows. But knowing how to do theoretical debate and experimental competition will always be valuable to you. That will, right, always give you access to the pursuit of knowledge. Okay, so another set of experiments, we use the individual differences methodology to try and pick up on this thing we talked about briefly before, this sense of leaping in an insight problem. I don't know, I don't know, I know! What happened in between? Nothing! So it's interesting here. This is this metaphor, I like this leaping metaphor, that is trying to metaphorically integrate the search inference framework and the perceptual framework. Because you're moving through space, but you've left the ground. So you're, right? So it's trying to combine, right, revisualization, because you're in one place and suddenly you're in the other, with that you've moved through space. What they're trying to pick up on is this gap in processing. Now, interestingly enough, the researchers are going to try and operationalize that and to theorize as to what's going on in that gap. And to propose some interesting beginnings of an alternative to the computational framework for trying to understand what's going on. It's a beginning. So this work was done by, oh, I forgot to bring my computer. I wanted to show you something. I'll try and remember it next time when I do the review to at least show you. Baker Senate, who I now think is back to being Baker, and CC, 1996. So they're going to use an individual differences methodology to study what they call inductive leaping. Now, because I take induction to be an inferential process, I think the word they're using there is incorrect. They shouldn't be calling it inductive leaping, because that's the whole point. of what they're trying to talk about. So I'm going to recommend, to avoid confusion, especially those who've done some work in logic and what induction and deduction are, etc. I'm going to recommend that we call what they're talking about cognitive leaping rather than inductive leaping. Okay, so let's talk about how they operationalize leaping, and then what's the theory behind it, what's the theoretical argumentation behind this. So what they did was they gave people a series of cues. I wish what they said, I forgot to bring that. I wanted to show you this in direct visual imagery. But what I can show you initially is just a bunch of dots on a screen, and you'll look at it and you go, I don't know what that is. And then I'll fill in more dots, and you might say, I don't know what it is. And then more dots, and then at some point you go, oh, that's a sofa. You understand the task? So what I can do is I can, right, I can time, right, every 10 seconds or so, more dots are added. And your instruction is the following. Try to use fewer cues, that's one way of putting it, or try as soon as you can to tell me what this is going to be a picture of. They also did it with word stems, but the pictures are I think, less confounded. So, does everybody understand the task? Now, a good cognitive leaper is somebody who uses fewer cues, but reliably gets the answer. By the way, on your test, put cognitive leaper if the question comes up. It's funny the first time, but by the fourth or fifth time, reading about cognitive lepers is not funny. It's weird and kind of distressing. Okay? All right. So here's the proposal. People who are better at being cognitive leapers, they can use fewer cues, but yet accurately come to the right answer, will be better at insight problem solving. So first of all, before we go on, they received good experimental confirmation for that. The better you are at leaping, the better you are at problem solving. Okay, so let's stop here, and now I'm going beyond what they say in the experiment. I'm going to start with what's directly implied by what they're saying, and then I'm going to build beyond in a way they might not have thought to talk about. I don't think it's inconsistent with what they're talking about, okay? So this is slowly progressing more and more into my voice out of their voice. Now, what they're initially talking about, it looks like, is your capacity for pattern completion. Right? And your pattern for pattern completion, right, is a very interesting ability that you have. One thing you should know is the ability to do this is one of the best tests we have for your general intelligence. Raven's progressive matrices, right? Yes?
Isn't that also not necessarily like there's lots of different types of intelligence tests, and that results are typically consistent but are not consistent enough to be generalized? Like if someone has ADHD or dyslexia or something,
Yeah.
that there's like really specific problems,
Sure.
types of problems that they can't.
But these are comparative standards, right? So,
No, but I mean like, so there's specific areas that are used in some types of problem-solving measures, but not in others.
well, I'm not quite sure I agree with the second thing you're saying, but before I address that, let me address the first thing. Right, I mean, none of these measures are perfect, but there's no measure in psychology that's better than our measures for G in terms of its predictive capacity over your behavior. Nothing comes close to G's ability to predict your academic success, your life success, your health success. It is our most powerful predictor. So, is it perfect? No, but it's really strong. It's really powerful. So it's getting at something. So I think it should be treated that way. Secondly, the idea that there are different types of intelligences, if that's what you're suggesting, okay. Let me address that first then. That has not received good empirical confirmation, that hypothesis. So the multiple intelligence ideas, etc. So if you're not saying, so what is it other than that that you're advocating for, Chloe?
What I'm saying is, like, if you tested someone who had ADHD based on like pattern completion, based on working memory, based on other types of problem solving ability, they can get 99th percentile in one and like 30th percentile in the other. So it's not an accurate measure even of problem solving, let alone of like different types of life skills. So because you're not measuring, obviously if like there's certain types of like learning disabilities also that can follow similar patterns, that there's obviously between that type of pattern completion problem solving and another type of problem solving in which someone can do, there's a difference between that.
But, I mean, first of all, you're talking about pathological cases, and the pathology might be exactly that's what's breaking down is the fact that in general there is a strong positive manifold between those tests. How you do on these tests is strongly predictive of how you do on all the others, suggesting there's a general ability underneath them. And once again, that general ability measure is a very powerful predictor across many domains. So the fact that in some individuals it might be breaking down is not evidence that that general ability doesn't exist. It might be that what's actually being affected is the generalizability of the ability, right?
Kind of, but I'm not.
Well, you don't, what is it you want to, you're not saying that, that your IQ is unaffected by learning disabilities or things like that. That's not what you're saying, right?
Well, I mean, that's like a different point that can or can't be depending on the types of tests that are used.
Mm-hmm.
But like, that's not, I was just saying like, if there's a difference between that, then there's obviously something that's there in some problem solving measures, but not in others, and like how, if you're like, evidence that people can do, if there's a disassociation, so that people can do really well in one and badly in the other, or really well in the other and badly in the second one, then they're not, like even within problem solving, then there's something that's causing the ability of them not to be associated?
Sure, sure.
Is that because they're different?
No, so that's not good evidence. It's good evidence that they're not identical, but the claim was never that they were identical processes. The subtests are all somehow tapping into an underlying core general ability. That's what explains the consistent positive manifold and the ability again for that manifold to predict across many different domains of life. So I'm not quite sure what the thesis is you're criticizing, or what you're like. The idea that there's a general ability behind it, the evidence for that is very strong. What you're saying is somehow in certain individuals it gets skewed so that a general ability goes here, but it doesn't go there. Yeah, I agree with that. What follows from that?
Well, I was just saying, like, would they be different so that you would know? I mean, it seems like you're saying that they're not, but I was just wondering, like, would it be different because you can get different results? Like, why would the general ability, like, if there's something that could, if you're saying, like, it can skew one way or the other,
Sure.
then obviously there's something that's, like, affecting that skew. But before, I was just thinking, like, obviously if there could be different results that are produced, then it's not a correlation that is always
The case, that's
the
right.
case. Then, like, that has to be accounted for in some way. And if you're saying, like, it's just because the general ability is skewed, then
Right,
that
so
would be
here's
one way.
one way. So what also is highly correlated with measures of general intelligence are measures of working memory capacity, and things like attention can alter how working memory is being used. So ADHD could skew working memory, which could then skew how the general ability is being implemented. That would be one way, for example. Did I understand your question? And again, there's independent measure, so independent of things like Raven's progressive matrices, there's independent measures that working memory use is also highly predictive of your general intelligence abilities. And we know, of course, that attention alters how you're using your working memory. So if you had something that was affecting attention, it could skew working memory, which could then affect your general intelligence being implemented in one way rather than another. Is that okay for an answer? Okay, there was another question, yes.
I wrote in my notes, like, initially measured capacity for pattern completion. I was just wondering, like, what that was referring to.
So before I got into the discussion with Chloe, what I was saying is that what we're measuring, what Baker, Sennett, and Cece are measuring in the experiment, I would say, is plausibly pattern completion. And what I was saying is one of our strongest tests for your intelligence ability, your ability to solve problems, is a pattern completion test. Raven's progressive matrix. And then that's how we got into the discussion about sort of measures of general intelligence. Okay, now what's interesting about pattern recognition, and okay, this is meant to be, again, a step towards a theoretical formulation, is that pattern completion abilities have traditionally been very difficult for standard computational machines to carry out. The reason for that is that pattern completion problems are often what are called multiple simultaneous constraint problems. Now notice, we should be thinking about this because we already criticized the idea of a single constraint, multiple simultaneous constraint problems. Okay, so let me give you the classic example, and then let's talk about how it was solved. Okay? So you can do things like this. So you can read that, and what does it say? Okay. And here you read this as an H, and you read it here as an A. Okay. Now this was actually a very difficult problem, because if you try to represent this sort of initially, inferentially, you can get into weird kinds of binds. Because this is what you'll say. In order to read the word, I have to read the individual letters. But in order to disambiguate the letters, I have to read the word, which means reading is impossible. Because until I read the word, the letters are ambiguous, but I can't read the word until I can read the letters. Therefore, reading is impossible. So it's an illusion. What you're doing is, this is an illusion. Okay, now what the answer was, what is the answer, by the way? What have you now taught the answer? I'm interested. How do we do this? What do you think? Yes, Gina?
You're simultaneously doing top-down and bottom-up.
Right. So you're simultaneously doing top-down and bottom-up processing in a self-organizing fashion. Okay? Pattern recognition seems to involve having to deal with multiple simultaneous constraints by doing self-organizing processing that is working simultaneously top-down and bottom-up. I'm using a non-controversial example. Is that okay? Now, the machines that turned out to be very good at doing this, in contrast to standard computational machines, and the people who first solved this problem were people like David Rumelhart and Geoffrey Hinton, because they were able to get neural networks to solve this problem very readily. Because neural networks work in terms of parallel distributed processing, many types of processing going on simultaneously in a both top-down and bottom-up fashion, in a self-organizing fashion. Now right now this is suggestive, and that's all I'm going to do with it right now. But this is suggestive because, as many of you know, neural network theory has consistently presented itself as a theoretical alternative to computational processing. Yes?
Sorry, so when you're reading a word, you don't actually have to read all three of the letters, because you can get some information from just the T and the D.
Sure.
So you're not actually focusing on the A or A shape when you are trying to figure out the word. So I don't see how that's kind of, like the circle you just mentioned, you have to read the word to know the letter, and you have to know the letter to know the word.
Right.
But if you erase one of the letters, and you erase the letter in the middle, you sort of can guess the word without having to know what exactly that letter is.
So but that's because you already have some model of the whole word, which you're using to fill it in. Where's that coming from? Some top-down process that tells you what the whole word is, right? So that's right. Okay, so what's going on, right, is the idea that, now again, this is now me doing cognitive science extension beyond Baker, Sennett, and Cece. that maybe what's going on when you're cognitive thinking, right, is pattern completion. And pattern completion is using this kind of simultaneously top-down, bottom-up, self-organized process that can be implemented in neural networks, which is very different than the logical inferential processing, propositional processing that is central to computers. It's a very different model than the search inference framework, because it's not inferentially driven. It's not driven by inferences operating on propositions. It's driven by, right, a self-organized dynamic relation between top-down and bottom-up processing. Now that's interesting because that suggests a potential, I'll get your question in a sec, that suggests a potential source for a rigorous theoretical alternative to the search inference computational framework that was never provided by the Gestalt people. Yes?
Sorry, I just didn't completely catch the, okay, so if humans have like parallel distribution processing.
Right.
Computers are...
Oh, what, and let's be careful what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you don't do computational processing. I'm not making that claim. What I'm claiming is that a better model for how you do this kind of thing is the kind of thing that's going on in neural networks, which is a process in which you've got self-organized, a self-organizing relationship between top-down and bottom-up processing, like in here when you're doing the cat.
Thank you.
Okay. And notice that there's an aspect of your cognition that has this bottom-up, top-down self-organizing capacity to it, namely your attention. So one of the things in which this kind of model is frequently invoked is attention. Attention is both bottom-up, so that if I do that, it grabs your attention, but I can also drive it top-down. How's your right big toe doing right now? Okay? And of course, the two, right, are always things are trying to grab your attention, you're trying to direct your attention, but as you direct your attention, that will grab your attention. And people are talking more and more about attention being this kind of simultaneously bottom-up, top-down, self-organizing process. So we might have the potential for an alternative understanding of the core processes that are going on in restructuring. This is a beginning. Yes?
So if Baker and Cece's task is related to like pattern recognition,
yeah,
and if that pattern recognition is like related to insight problem solving, and if and if what they're measuring is like kind of indicative of like IQ and pattern recognition is indicative of IQ, is insight problem solving and IQ like very related?
There's a problem with that, and this is one of Sternberg's criticisms of it. So standard IQ measures are not predictive of insight because guess what most of the problems are in standard IQ measures. They're all well-defined problems, and very few of them involve this. What Sternberg has done is he has taken, and I do more of this in 371, he's taken standard IQ tests and then added to them insight problem solving and produced a measure that combines the two, and that turns out to be a much better predictor than standard IQ measures for academic success, blah, 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 stuff like that.
So like would the Ravian psychometrics be like an example of like something that's very like, because it feels like it would be like very...
It should do both, yeah. I think so too. And that, this is leaping ahead, so I can't immediately justify what I'm going to say, but a lot of people are arguing that what you're measuring when you're measuring sort of, especially like the fluid aspects of G, is you're measuring cognitive flexibility, right? And that cognitive flexibility turns out to be the single biggest predictor of your capacity for insight problem solving.
Okay.
Now, all of this is encouraging, right? Because it means that we're on the right track then. If we're getting at this core ability and it's pointing us back to sort of core measures and core theoretical constructs for intelligence, then we're on the right track.
Okay.
Then we're on the right track. But as I'm also indicating, we're also on the sort of the cutting edge. This is where a lot of people are proposing what needs to be done next and what has not yet been done, which is good for you, right? Because you want to know what your future is, not just your past. Yes, Emma.
So you were saying that the top-down, bottom-up parallel processing involved in pattern completion is native to neural network models,
not the search inference framework, and you said that this was something that the Gestaltists could have used if, like, more scientifically to reply?
Yes,
Okay,
that's exactly what I said.
okay.
I mean, I don't want to be unfair to them because it didn't exist. You guys should be using neural network theory.
But that, okay, that's, so you're saying it aligns with the Gestalt ideas, but it's a scientific interpretation as opposed to my philosophical one?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
And what I haven't yet established it, or even yet given you evidence for believing it, all I'm saying is, this is now at least a rigorous alternative that would give something that, give a vocabulary, a conceptual vocabulary to the Gestaltists, so that we could start to get the debate going even better. And this is when, for the 1996, come on, any of you who did 250 with me, why is this an important date for neural networks? Jeffrey Hinton, 1996, the wake-sleep algorithm is invented the same year. For those of you who know, the best way you do unsupervised self-organized learning in neural networks. All this stuff is happening at about the same time. Yes?
Is it possible that you could have like an inferential question that ends up being answered by insight?
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yep. So and people can move back and forth between them. Interestingly enough, there's been some recent research, and I'll talk about it later in the course, that you should give quite a bit of trust when you solve your problems by insight process. They do tend to be better solutions than your incremental. We'll come back to that. Again, within certain constraints. All right, let's get back to Baker, Sennett, and CC. All right. So again, what did they say? They did some brilliant stuff. They operationalized leaping. I think they misnamed it with inductive leaping because the stuff with the SOFA dots, that's not induction. That's not induction. That's maybe abduction, but it's not induction, right? You're not saying I have this pattern of dots, then they're all black, and so all these dot patterns. It's not induction, right? So let's put that aside. So you've got cognitive leaping, and then it's plausible, especially given the way they describe it, that what they're pointing to is a pattern completion ability that's sort of a strong predictor of insight. And then I point out that pattern completion seems to involve, right, dealing with multiple simultaneous constraints, right? And, right, we have an alternative theoretical construct for talking about this, and that is, a self-organization of top-down and bottom-up processing within neural networks. Final point on that, is that okay as a recapitulation of the whole argument? Final point on that. Another thing that neural networks have been better at than standard computational models is at procedural knowledge, skill abilities. In fact, almost all of the renaissance that's going on right now in AI, not all of it, but a lot of it, one of my students and one of my co-authors, Tim Willowcraft, some of the work that he's doing, right, is about coming up with very powerful machines for dealing with procedural abilities. See, skills also tend to, like knowing how to catch a ball seems to involve, again, this kind of problem. Multiple simultaneous constraints that are unfolding dynamically in a self-organizing fashion. And your cognition has to deal with that in order to be able to know how to catch a ball. So maybe this is also why, right? Again, maybe, because right now we're just trying to come up with a plausible conceptual vocabulary. We have to do this because the Gestalt people don't have it, right? But maybe why insight seems so procedural in nature is precisely because it's exactly this kind of processing that we're talking about. All right. Now, as you may expect, the search inference framework just didn't roll over and die. Okay? It didn't go, you're right, especially 96, because sorry, this doesn't mean to be self-promotional, but people weren't considering that, you know, all of this stuff could be sort of integrated together theoretically in terms of dynamical processing within neural networks, because that would be anachronistic. People were just beginning to get those ideas. As I said, Geoffrey Hinton introduces a self-organizing dynamical system into neural networks in that same year, 1996, as a way of making, giving them a capacity for learning that is now generating a lot of the success that Hinton and his protégés are getting in AI. Okay, so again, I'm not being anachronistic or unfair, I hope. All right, now, the search inference framework around this time, sort of after Metcalfe, but before Schuller and Melcher, and before Baker, Satisficing, has one of its best replies to the work, especially of Metcalfe. And we mentioned this already, but let's go into it again. And this is the work of Kaplan and Simon, right, from 1990. Okay, and this is indeed the Simon from Newell and Simon. And now, I hope you understand better the joke in the title of their article. The title of the article is In Search of Insight. It's an academic joke. Now, that tells you what the title is brilliant. It tells you what their stance is. They're now admitting, they've given up the Weisberg and Anova thing, there's no such thing as insight. They're admitting there is such a thing, but what are they ultimately going to do? If it has the title In Search of Insight, they're going to show that it can ultimately still be handled by the search inference framework. Okay? Again, see how even like you can get into stuff more deeply if you situate experimental competition within theoretical debate. Okay, so they are going to study something I talked about, and I foreshadowed this experiment when I mentioned this to you before in the first class, and we talked about they used the mutilated chessboard problem. Remember the mutilated chessboard problem? Remember, you can cover it with the dominoes, I removed the two corners. And the insight is to realize that you shouldn't formulate it as a covering problem, you should formulate it as a parity problem, and if you do, it goes from being combinatorially explosive to very tractable. So you're all nodding, you all remember, yay. Now, what's interesting, first of all, is to look at their theoretical response, because, okay, this is, I'm sorry, I'm having a lot of fun, right? Well, I shouldn't apologize for that. But what I mean is, okay, what they're doing is really cool. If there's going to be something sort of wrong about what they're doing, their theoretical move, I think, and I'll try and give you an argument why, but there's something really right about it because it's prescient. It's really prescient. They come up with something abstractly that's going to turn out to be discovered concretely in what's going on in the brain. It's really cool. It's really cool. So, although I'm going to be sort of criticizing the theoretical move, I also want to, I hope it comes across that I have a lot of respect for it, because it's actually foreshadowing something really important in a very prescient manner. And I think it might, I'm not sure, I haven't been able to trace the history, although this article is very influential. I think it might have even influenced young Beeman and Bowman's work and stuff like that. Okay? All right. Yes?
I think my question is very related. It's just dialectical, really. So if this was published in 1990, then how is it a response to the...
It's a response to Metcalfe.
Okay. And that was... Okay. Great.
So, what they do, remember, is they agree that insight exists. They talk about it as restructuring of problem formulation, and then they operationalize problem formulation as a search for a problem formulation. Okay. And what they do then is they divide insight problem solving into two levels of analysis. There's the primary level, and then there's the meta level. So, the primary level is the level at which you're searching for a solution to your problem. Now, one thing, this is not Weisberg and Alba's memory compartmentalization thing. Even though I'm drawing these boxes, this is not. This is a different thing. And I have a lot more respect for this. And like I said, I'm going to argue later that it's prescient. And it shows again the value of theoretical debate in order to foreshadow and even at times before empirical investigation. Okay, so the idea of Kaplan and Simon is there's a primary level, you're trying, this is where you're searching for a solution to a problem. You can't get a solution. Perhaps it's combinatorially explosive. What you then do is you shift to a meta level. This is not the level of a formulated problem. This search space is a search space through all possible problem formulations. Okay. So this is the search space of problem formulations. This is the search space of a formulated problem. The main idea is, this is what insight is. This doesn't work. You switch to this space. You find an alternative problem formulation. You bring it back to here, and then that affords you solving the problem. And that's what insight is. Insight is this movement to, right, and then back from the meta space that restructures this problem space so that it becomes solvable for you. So first again, this is going to turn, this kind of shifting, right, is going to turn out to be relevant. Notice how this is intelligent, because they could plausibly say that the shifting is what's reflected in the sudden spike. You shift and when you come back, that's when you get it, right? So it's very plausible. And like I said, it's going to turn out, and I'll just foreshadow, that this seems to map onto sort of hemispheric shifting and processing that seems to be correlated with insight, which also seems to be correlated with the Metcalfe stuff. Yes, Becky?
But it's the same type of processing that happens when you're searching the problem formulations,
Yes.
right? Like it's still a search.
Yes. Okay, so now Becky is putting her finger on the very narrow theoretical place that Kaplan and Simon are trying to stand on. It's the razor's edge. Because in order for this to all be computational, the same kind of processing has to be going on here as here, right? That's what they want to argue. But if the same type of processing is going on here and here, and do you think this space is a small space? No, it's probably what kind of space? Combinatorially explosive. So if exactly the same thing is going on here and here, is that going to make any difference? Which is your point, I take it. So what they need, this is the hard place they're getting into. They need the process going on here to be different in kind to prevent the infinite regress. Because you don't want to say, well, you know what I do here? I go to another space to look for a problem formulation. Okay? So the way you prevent an infinite regress is that there has to be an important difference in kind between one stage and another stage. Right? So, what they need to say, one part of their mouth, if I could use that metaphor, we're speaking out of two sides of your mouth at the same time. One side has to say, the processing going on here has to be different in kind from the processing going on there. That's in order to prevent the infinite regress. But the other side of their mouth has to say, but this is all just computational processing, because that is how we are defending the search inference framework against the Gestalt alternative. Now, let me be really careful here. And this is subtle. I get this. And this is subtle in abstract thinking, which is hard. I get that too. I am not accusing them of a contradiction, because I technically have not shown you a contradiction. What I've shown you, though, is that this is a very, very narrow theoretical space. They somehow have to say it's different in kind, right? So the infinite regress is blocked, but it's basically still the same stuff, the same kind of computational processes. Now that's not technically a definition, a contradiction, but it's getting really close. Did that pick up on your point? Good. Okay, so they're in a very tight space. Okay, one more time. Although I'm launching into this criticism, nevertheless, this is not Weisberg and Anova, right? This is not the compartments of memory search, okay? And secondly, there's something, again, this is brilliantly prescient. This foresees something that seems to be the case. This shifting idea seems to be a really important one and may correspond to a shift between computational into non-computational processes, etc. Okay. Now, did somebody have a question over here?
Maybe I should let you go on. I was just wondering why it isn't a contradiction.
Why it isn't a contradiction? Because there may be a way of saying it's like, see, because the line between differences of degree and differences of kind is not one that philosophy and logic has been able to actually specify. What I call Righties paradoxes. Okay, here's the technical reason. Okay, if I'm not bald and I remove one hair from my head, does that make me bald? No. So removing one hair from a non-bald head doesn't make me bald. So I'm non-bald, I removed another hair, I'm still not bald. So I should be able to remove all of my hair and still not be bald. But I'd be bald, wouldn't I? That's a paradox, okay? So at some point a difference of degree becomes a difference of kind. But do we know exactly where that is? No. So they could say, well, it's a really big difference of degree, but not completely a difference of kind, and therefore it's not a contradiction. That's a technical reason, to be fair. Is that okay? You see, philosophers actually do some really useful stuff. Okay. Now, they know this problem. So to bring it up is fair. So what Becky did, excellent. Because they themselves bring it up. They realize, right, that they face a problem. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not misattributing something to them. This is a direct quote. Right, this is from page 376 in the original production. The same processes that ordinarily used to search within problem space can be used to search for a problem space, a problem representation, which is what you call a problem formulation. So I'm not misattributing. See, that is the statement of there's no fundamental difference between the two. Okay? However, they get that the meta level is combinatorially explosive, and so they then go on to say the crux in problem solving is selectivity in search. So what they want is right, something that gives them a kind of selectivity here, right, that will operate differently than what operates here. And so they propose a heuristic that operates at the meta level that's not operating at the primary level. Okay? So this is, they're putting all of their theoretical baskets into this heuristic. Okay? It's called the notice invariance heuristic. I'll talk just a little bit about it and then we'll wrap up because a lot of you are starting to get a glazed look. It's about like, I'm full of too many thoughts. But I can't tell you what any of them individually is. Okay, So let's just talk about, I'll just briefly talk about it, and then I'll introduce a sort of point, and then we'll come back and pick up on it, and that'll give us sort of going momentum in the next class, okay? The idea is that what you do is what you're going to do is you're going to look at failed problem formulations. Here's a failed problem formulation, here's another failed problem formulation, and here's another failed problem formulation, okay? So, what should you do? Try to notice what is invariant across all of these different failed problem formulations. What is not changing. What's not changing is this base, for example. I'm just using this pictorially, okay? Try to notice what's not changing across your failed problem formulations. Now why? Because you're failing. There is probably a common cause to all of your individual failures. That common cause plausibly, or probably even, although not certainly, probably is related to what is invariant in your problem formulation. It's what you're not changing that is preventing you from solving the problem. So you try to notice what's invariant, and then that is what you're going to change in your problem formulation. And then that is what you're going to bring back down here to see if it reformulates your problem. Does that make sense? All right. Now that's kind of cool, first of all. So, like I said, I'm going to take 2 more minutes, and then I'll let you go, okay? Notice how gestalty this heuristic is. The notice in your, I mean, that's a new adjective, by the way. You can now use it. It's very gestalty. Okay, so adding on an English, what is that? That's a suffix to a German word. It's gestalty. Okay?
Can we use it in an exam?
Yes, you have explicit permission. You can use the adjective gestalty. Okay, first of all, it's notice, which is an attentional salience term, not an inferential propositional term. Right? And notice, sorry, how it's using, right, like for example, a kind of field disembedding that was predictive of insight problem solving, just like people from the Gestalt tradition, Schuller and Melcher people, had shown. So this is a very Gestalty heuristic. It's not really operating very computationally. Now there's also, in addition to that, right, there's a logical problem. How many things remain invariant across, right, something that's changing?
Infinite.
Combinatorially explosive. Okay. So again, it has to somehow be a zeroing in on, right, a subset of all the possible invariants. Okay, so what are we getting to? We're getting to this point, and let me just wrap it up one more minute, and then I'll let you go. Okay. What we're getting to is this idea that the search inference framework is coming back, and they're coming back really strong. They're coming back with a theoretical, advance. Like what we've got these 2 levels. We've got the shifting relationship, and then and then what we've got is we've got a different kind of heuristic, search heuristic operating at the meta level. It's going to turn out to be a really important idea, by the way, the notice invariance heuristic. So let's give all of that. And this shifting idea and a different kind of, attentional processing, this is all prescient, because one of the ways you can reliably talk about the differences between the left and the right hemisphere is in terms of their attentional processing of information. Okay, in fact, that seems to be the best sort of evolutionary account for why you have lateralization between the left and the right hemisphere. Okay, we'll come back to all of that. So that's all great. That's good. Yes. Problem with this is, it's really questionable whether or not they've actually succeeded in what they wanted to do. Did they find a landing space in that very narrow space? Or have they actually come up with a Gestalt process that's really not computational in nature? Okay, that's it for today. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll pick it up next time. Really good discussion, really good involvement. I appreciate it. It makes the class enjoyable for me as well, and I think it helps your fellow students.